Hello, I'm Christopher Harding. I teach at the University of Edinburgh and I work on Japanese and Indian history in particular. On this course we're going to focus on American foreign policy towards Japan in the middle of the 20th century, particularly in the context of the Cold War and America's strategic aims towards East Asia, so Vietnam, Korea, China and Japan. The way we're going to run the course is we'll start off looking at the US's relationship with Japan in a broader historical framework. Then we're going to move on to look at the Pacific War, the bombings, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then look at America's Cold War strategic aims in Asia, which will be of use to those of you who are thinking about that in relation to Vietnam, in relation to Korea, to China and elsewhere. And then we're going to move on to this period of American occupation in Japan, where America tried to reform Japanese national life, Japanese constitution, her armed forces, and really every dimension of Japanese society and culture.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
In 1945, when the Japanese finally surrendered to the Americans and to the Allies, it was the first time in 1,400 years that the Japanese had lost a conflict. For most of that period, they'd been quite careful about their foreign relations, always suspicious about having too much to do with outside countries. Their main relationships historically, of course, were with China and were with Korea. Where the Europeans were concerned, Europeans were going to Japan really from the 16th century onwards. But the Europeans tended to be too much interested in religion, trying to convert Japanese to Christianity. Also, they were interested in politics, trying to reorganize Japan's politics and establish alliances between the Japanese government and European powers. The Japanese, unsurprisingly, didn't really take to that, and they threw most of the Europeans out of Japan at the beginning of the 17th century. And from that period, really for two centuries, 2.5 centuries after that, they had as little to do as possible with Europe, with the Western world in general. It's what the Japanese call the Sakoku period, the closed country period. There was only one exception to this in this period. They would deal with the Dutch. From the 1600s through to the early 1800s, just one tiny part of the famous city of Nagasaki was opened up to Dutch traders so they could come in, trade goods with the Japanese, and then leave again. There was to be no bigger involvement in Japanese politics or with Japanese people. So you get this picture, I think, of a country that's quite isolationist, as I say, that's quite suspicious towards the outside world, trying to manage its foreign relations as far as possible. So when does this start to change? When do the Americans first make their way into Japan's national life? Well, it all begins with what the Japanese have called the big black ships. In the middle of the 1850s, Commodore Matthew Perry from the US makes his way off the coast of Japan in these huge steamships that most Japanese people had never seen the like of before. This was an entirely alien technology to a culture that was using generally small wooden ships with a large array of oars to power them. So this was quite an impressive fleet of black ships. It was quite frightening. People didn't really know what they were going to make of Commodore Matthew Perry. And when he arrives off the coast of Japan, what he wants is to open Japan up to trade, to relations with the United States more broadly, so that the US can park its ships, anchor its ships off the coast of Japan, get its goods, get its supplies, and try and see if it can establish a profitable relationship with Japan. The Japanese authorities aren't really sure that they want to have any kind of relationship at all with the United States. And what they say in 1853 to Matthew Perry is, well, let's think about it. We have to go up to the top to what's nowadays called Tokyo, called Edo in this period, and negotiate with the shogun, who's the leader of the Japanese government at that point, and see whether we want to have any kind of diplomatic relationship with the US at all. Just to give you an idea of the tenor of this relationship at the very beginning, from the American side, Commodore Matthew Perry's response to this is to say, okay, I'm going to go away, I'll come back in a year's time, but before I go, let me give you this piece of white cloth, and he hands it over. He says, if I come back in a year's time, and you tell me no, you say no to a set of trading relationships, diplomatic relationships with the United States, there's going to be an armed conflict, which you're going to lose in very short order, and you can use this piece of white cloth to surrender with. So I think you get a sense there already of the Western world, led by the Americans, but quickly the Europeans and the Russians afterward, trying to push themselves into Japan as, I suppose, an idea of a globalizing world by the mid-late 19th century that Japan can no longer try to reject or fend off or keep itself separate from. So really from the 1850s onwards into the 1860s, 1870s, Japan has to accept there are going to be relationships with America, going to be relationships with Great Britain, France, Germany, and these other countries. And the more that Japan develops relationships with these countries, the more she sees just how far behind she's become as a country. Japanese leaders go to America, they go to Britain, they go to France, they tour the big cities, London, Manchester, San Francisco. And what they find is these countries are so far ahead in terms of the level of their technology, certainly their military equipment, certainly also in terms of their level of cultural achievement, in terms of what their industries can produce, in terms of the level of energy that they're able to produce to keep their economies running, banking, structure, all the kind of things you learn about in 19th century history of Western Europe and the US. All these things Japan decides she has to get as soon as possible. The one reason why Japan is in such a hurry, especially when it comes to her relationships with America and Western Europe, is she looks across the water to what's happening in China. And what's happening in China is that because the Chinese, like the Japanese, were quite slow to develop relationships with the Western world, they find themselves being more or less attacked, more or less carved up into spheres of interest by these European powers. China is no longer a sovereign nation in any meaningful way. And the Japanese leaders say to themselves, unless we quickly modernize, this is the really key word in this period, unless we modernize our military, our industry, our banking, infrastructure, educate our people, establish a media, all these key aspects of modern life, unless we get these, very soon we're going to become part of an American empire, or a British empire, or a French empire. So Japan really, for most of the 19th century, from Commodore Matthew Perry's visit onwards, sees itself as being under immense existential threat from the West. It wakes up to the way the world is really operating in the late 19th century, and it really is playing catch-up. The aim of Japan then from this period is to become, as far as possible, a great leader in Asia, ideally to establish an empire of her own in Asia, which she starts to do from the late 19th century onwards. So by the early 20th century, as America is refashioning her foreign policy, she looks across the Pacific to Japan and she sees here is a power that we really need to look quite carefully at. A generation earlier, the Americans were selling weapons to the Japanese, helping them to develop their industry and their military. But now, Japan in her own right is looking like being a real potential threat to the Americans. In the 1890s, little Japan wins a war against huge China with her fantastic civilizational history, her quite powerful military. It's a surprise around the world. But an even bigger shock comes in 1905, when Japan wins in very short order a conflict against Russia. Now this is huge news all around the world. This is the first Asian power to win a war against a white Western power. For any country around the world, especially in Asia and Africa, struggling against colonialism, struggling against the West, Japan is suddenly the pin-up for anti-colonial nationalism, anti-Western assertion, a kind of hero in Asia. So the Americans take quite a close look at Japan at this point. And when, during the period of the First World War, Japan ends up on the side of the Allies, when the First World War is over and people are negotiating who gets what, carving up the spoils, as it were, Japan isn't given as much as the Japanese government and the Japanese people feel that she should be given. Now this is where relations between America and Japan really start to sour around 1919, 1920. So the division of the spoils after the First World War goes against Japan, at least that's what her government and her people, whipped up by the media, think. Also, as the League of Nations is being established, Japan and other Asian nations try to get a clause which emphasizes the equality of all people around the world, a kind of racial equality, which seems common sense nowadays, but 100 years ago, a lot of the European powers don't want to give those sorts of assurances. And there's one basic reason why that would be the case, because the French and the British in particular have empires in Asia, Southeast Asia, and also in Africa. And if you establish a principle of the equality of all peoples, of all races, then that places a big question mark over the legitimacy of empire. Now, the Japanese don't get that. They don't get what they want. And then in the years following 1919, you get the Americans starting to alter their immigration laws to prevent Japanese and other Asian nations letting people move across the Pacific and move into the United States to set up home there, the so-called yellow peril that the Americans start to feel. And so the Japanese really get this sense in the early 1920s that despite all their efforts to modernize, the Americans don't take them seriously, the Europeans don't take them seriously. If they want to be the great power to which they aspire, then what they're going to have to do is basically go their own way. This is what happens in the 1920s and 1930s in Japan. The Americans and the Japanese try to keep things friendly, but the Japanese are slowly building up an empire in East and Southeast Asia, and they're looking more and more to think about where their resources are going to come from. Japan is not a very resource-rich country. They need oil, they need coal, they need to get these things from elsewhere, whether it's Taiwan, the Philippines, and other areas of Southeast Asia. And at the same time, American interests are stretching across the Pacific, places like Hawaii, and of course further across towards the Japanese coast. And this, by the 1930s, is looking like potentially a very, very hot area, an area of future conflict. And in fact, in Japan, within her military, there are military ideologues, military writers who are dreaming of a conflict like that. There are these great fantastical stories being told of a future conflict, the ultimate world conflict between the Japanese and the Americans, a kind of world-defining conflict. And I think those kinds of fantasies explain why, when the Americans and the Japanese end up at war with one another, the Japanese go to the lengths they do not to lose. They will do absolutely anything not to have American military boots on Japanese home soil. And so by the late 1930s, this is all starting to erupt. The Japanese have moved into a northern part of China called Manchuria, and then famously in 1941, in early December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy makes a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. And we'll come to that in our next module.